Of all the places Letitia James expected to see cowardice in a uniform, she didn't expect it to be worn behind a check-in desk with a name tag that read Brenda. But there it was, brazen, polished, and smirking at a decorated Marine veteran like he was a nuisance, not a national treasure. Letitia stood 10 feet behind him, watching the exchange unfold with that same forensic precision she once used to dismantle billion-dollar financial frauds. And yet, in this moment, nothing felt more grotesque than what was happening at Gate 7B of Skylink Airlines. A 70-year-old man, Purple Heart recipient, retired U.S. Marine Sergeant Frank Miller, being interrogated over whether he had actually earned the scar above his eyebrow. "You don't look like you need assistance," Brenda said flatly, flicking her eyes across Frank's posture like a TSA scanner with an attitude problem. "People who actually need pre-boarding usually have wheelchairs, or a limp you can at least notice." That last sentence wasn't just dismissive, it was deliberate. Cruelty with punctuation. Frank didn't flinch, he didn't argue, didn't raise his voice. That wasn't how he was built. He simply nodded once and said, "It's shrapnel damage, ma'am." "My hip locks up. I just need a head start in the aisle so I don't slow anyone down." Then he offered his VA card and pointed, almost apologetically, to the Purple Heart tag on his keychain. Brenda didn't even pretend to look. "Right," she said. "And I suppose that scar's from storming a beach, huh?" She didn't laugh. She smirked, like she'd just caught him with a fake ID and a phony backstory. "More like a barstool incident if you ask me." The few passengers in earshot shifted uneasily. Some looked away, some stared openly. Not a single person stepped in. Not yet. Letitia's jaw tightened. She could have stepped forward, could have pulled rank, or at the very least thrown her own weight around as a high-ranking federal official. But she didn't. Not yet, because what she saw wasn't just a bad employee. It was a perfect case study, and she wanted to see just how far the rabbit hole of disregard would go. Frank stood there another few seconds, face weathered, still, absorbing the insult like it was enemy fire. Something he'd trained for, survived through, and learned not to return in kind. That's the thing about men like Frank. You can wound their body, you can dismiss their pain, but the one thing you never get to do, never, is cheapen their sacrifice. "It's a legitimate request," he said again, voice like gravel wrapped in discipline. "I'm not asking for an upgrade, just a chance to settle in." Brenda rolled her eyes. "Wait with everyone else. Zone 4. Then she turned away, already on to the next passenger. That's where the real silence hit. Not in Frank's response, but in the failure of the room around him. No applause, no outrage, just air conditioning and overhead announcements. Letitia watched the back of Frank's head as he turned slowly, limping toward the seats near the edge of the gate area. He didn't look embarrassed. He looked tired. Not the kind of tired you get from travel. The kind that accumulates when the country you served looks right past you. Letitia lowered her phone from where it hovered at chest level. She hadn't been recording, but she could recall every word. And unlike most people in that terminal, she wasn't about to scroll past it. You see, for some people, pre-boarding is about convenience. For Frank Miller, it was about dignity. And for Brenda, it was about control. The cheap kind. The kind that only exists when no one's watching. Unfortunately for her, someone was. Now, this wasn't going to be a viral video. Letitia didn't believe in weaponizing shame. She believed in correction, in consequences, in the kind of justice that didn't show up with a headline, but arrived in full uniform with flight credentials and a chain of command. She wasn't here to cause a scene. But that gate agent had just opened one, and the final act wouldn't be hers to script. It would be earned, just like Frank's scar. And Letitia James was not the type to leave dishonor unanswered. Letitia James didn't need a spotlight, and on that morning, she certainly wasn't dressed for one. A dark blazer, comfortable shoes, and a canvas tote that had seen one too many political roundtables. She looked like any other overworked professional on a connection layover. No entourage, no security detail. Just her and a seat at Gate 7B, where she was quietly trying to finish edits on a policy brief about ADA compliance in federal buildings. And then came Brenda. Not the federal kind of Brenda, the gate agent kind. The kind of Brenda that corporate training modules warn you about, but HR still promotes because she's great under pressure. Well, she was under pressure now, and boy was she crumbling in full display. Letitia had seen every second of it. The smug denial, the forensic-level scrutiny of a scar that had no business being questioned, and of course, the inevitable cherry on top. Zone 4, Sergeant. That last word hadn't been spoken with respect. It had been spit like gum on pavement. A reminder that in today's America, your decorations matter less than your ability to walk like you're not in pain. And pain isn't real until it makes someone else uncomfortable. Brenda wasn't just rude. She was the byproduct of a culture that prizes policies over principles and wields discretion like a cudgel rather than a shield. Letitia reached for her phone, slowly, deliberately, not to record, not to make a scene, but to preserve facts. Brenda's name tag, Flight 305, Skylink Airlines, the terminal, all of it. She wasn't collecting evidence for a TikTok video. She was building a file. An internal one that didn't rely on hashtags or outrage algorithms but on action, correction, and consequences. Letitia knew bureaucracy well. She knew that nothing terrifies a corporation more than a paper trail sent by someone who knows how to read the fine print they buried themselves in. As she tapped in the details, her eyes shifted again to Frank. The way he adjusted his weight slowly onto his right leg, the way his jaw flexed but never clenched, the way he folded his VAID and tucked it back into his pocket as if it were somehow a source of shame instead of proof of valor. This wasn't just another bad airport moment. This was a mirror. And in that reflection was every airline apology video that didn't come until the lawsuit. Every manager that trained employees to assess mobility visually rather than just listen. Every customer service rep who confused uniformity with justice. The real comedy here, and Letitia could appreciate irony when she saw it, was that Brenda likely considered herself a rule follower. She probably had a clipboard somewhere, laminated guidelines, and maybe even a self-righteous little quote pinned to her cubicle about integrity. And yet, here she was, slicing through a man's dignity with the bureaucratic equivalent of a butter knife. I don't see any injuries. Of course she didn't. Because the injuries were the kind that don't scan under metal detectors but haunt every staircase, every airport aisle, and every cold morning that makes a shrapnel-worn hip seize up. Letitia didn't move yet. She could have stood up, thrown her title across the room like a badge, and made it rain policy citations. But no, that wasn't the moment. The moment was still building. What Brenda didn't realize was that she had made two errors. The first was underestimating Frank. The second, more catastrophic, was thinking no one important was watching. That's the great blind spot of petty power. It always assumes the room is full of nobodies, until one of those nobodies turns out to be the Attorney General of New York. Letitia leaned back slightly, her phone now resting on her lap. She was no longer just documenting. She was calculating. What would be the most effective lever? Internal complaint? Direct contact with operations? Or perhaps something more public, but controlled? Not reactive, but restorative. That was the difference between a political stunt and a principled stand. She didn't need this moment to go viral. She needed it to go right. And still, no one around her moved. No one offered Frank a chair. No one whispered a word. A man who had taken live fire was now being iced out in silence. That wasn't apathy. It was trained indifference. The kind that's bred by years of being told that speaking up is inconvenient. Letitia didn't blame them, not entirely. It's hard to confront the system when you're holding a Starbucks and a boarding pass, but that's exactly why she was there. Because if people like her didn't intervene when it was inconvenient, what good was any of it? As Brenda barked orders at a young couple trying to juggle their stroller, Letitia's gaze cut back one final time to Frank. There was a weight to the way he stared at the floor, like he wasn't just standing in an airport, but on the edge of something much heavier. It wasn't about the seat. It was about the principle. And the principle had just been trampled by a badge, a uniform, and a company that hadn't yet realized the storm brewing 2 rows behind them. Letitia James shifted forward, laced her fingers together, and allowed herself a single exhale. The moment hadn't come yet, but it would. And when it did, she would be ready. Not as a politician, not as a public figure, but as a citizen with a spine and a memory sharp enough to cut through corporate spin. Because some insults don't fade with time. They demand answers. And Gate 7B was about to get one. Frank sat alone, a silhouette of weathered resolve tucked into the farthest chair near the gate's perimeter, where the tiled floor met the steel frame of a dusty window. He wasn't fuming, pacing, or composing a thread for social media. He wasn't wired that way. That kind of emotional exhibitionism belonged to the new era of performative grievance. Frank Miller came from a generation that bled in silence and saluted the flag with the same hand that once pulled a trigger for it. His only visible reaction was a slow shift of weight, a palm pressed into his hip, a soft, habitual gesture against the deeper ache that never left. If pain had a personality, Frank's had grown into a familiar ghost, persistent, private, and largely ignored. But just because Frank didn't demand attention didn't mean the situation would be allowed to fade. Because not 10 feet away, Letitia James stood, no longer an observer, but an executor. And if there was one thing she had built her career on, it was knowing the difference between letting something slide and letting something rot. Some people send emails. Letitia pulled levers. She stepped away from her row without fanfare, thumb already unlocking the encrypted channel on her secure device. The standard feedback form wasn't going to cut it. She wasn't interested in "your opinion matters" nonsense, or some AI-generated reply about looking into it. No, this required altitude, authority, a break glass in case of emergency escalation, and that's exactly what she triggered. Veteran Incident Protocol Tier 1, reserved only for live breaches of dignity involving service members in federal transit zones with immediate reputational exposure risk. The message was short, clinical, and lethal in its implication. Subject: immediate action required. Code Omega. Observed: Purple Heart recipient denied ADA-compliant pre-boarding access by gate agent. Status: Witnessed public mockery and dismissal of verified combat injury. Location: Skylink Gate 7B, Flight 305, Terminal C. Sent by LJUS. Attorney General observing on site. No signature, no flourish, just initials that meant something. Especially to those in the airline's executive chain who had long since been trained to recognize that when LJ shows up in the sender field, it's not a suggestion, it's a warning shot. Letitia hit send. In that moment, the air seemed to shift. Not because the passengers noticed, but because the gears above their heads, hidden behind access-only firewalls and dull executive titles, began to spin. There are few forces more terrifying to a risk-averse corporate infrastructure than the collision of bad optics and federal scrutiny. And now, those two had just shaken hands. Meanwhile, Brenda continued her one-woman performance of bureaucratic dominance, now chastising a teenager about the size of her carry-on. She still believed herself in control of the situation, a petty tyrant in polyester, blissfully unaware that the kingdom had already been overthrown. That was the tragicomic brilliance of people like her. They mistook compliance for correctness and forgot that policy is only powerful until someone with actual power reads it back to them. Letitia didn't look back at Brenda. She didn't need to. Her focus returned to Frank, who had shifted slightly in his seat, the way someone does when they're trying to make themselves small in a space that's already denied them visibility. It was the posture of a man used to being thanked on Veterans Day and forgotten the other 364. She watched as he reached into his jacket, not for drama, not for documentation, but for a bottle of generic painkillers. He swallowed them dry. Letitia's stomach turned. Here was a man who took a hit from shrapnel for his country and now had to take a hit of ibuprofen just to endure its hospitality. If that wasn't a metaphor for the current state of affairs, she didn't know what was. But this wouldn't end in metaphor. It would end in action. Letitia's phone vibrated. One vibration, then another, then two more. The chain was reacting. Somewhere an airline director was sitting upright. A pilot was being notified. A passenger manifest was being adjusted. And most importantly, a gate agent's name had just been flagged in a system that didn't believe in second chances when it came to slandering national service. Letitia inhaled once, slow and quiet, then slipped the phone back into her tote. Still no theatrics, no announcement, no power pose for the cameras. But beneath that calm exterior was a storm building with the precision of a legal brief and the velocity of a political reckoning. She knew the next phase wouldn't be hers to carry out, but it would carry her signature, silently embedded in every correction to come. And as the gate's loudspeaker crackled to life to announce Zone 1 boarding, the last thing Brenda should have been feeling was relief. Because what she didn't know, what she hadn't yet grasped through all her gatekeeping glory, was that the most powerful woman in the terminal had just turned the key on a chain of consequences that no priority boarding group could ever outrun. Across the polished floors and LED calm of Skylink's Operations Command Center, nestled behind layers of biometric locks and jargon-soaked flowcharts, a terminal pinged, not with a boarding delay, not with weather reroutes, but with something far more volatile, a Code Omega. The name alone was enough to jolt the coffee from the hands of a junior dispatcher and freeze a mid-sentence complaint from a regional manager in Texas. Because unlike passenger upgrades or lost luggage, Code Omega didn't involve customer inconvenience. It involved institutional shame. It meant a decorated veteran had been humiliated, publicly, at their gate, on their watch. The alert hit the screen in red. Priority 1, Purple Heart Incident. Gate 7B, Flight 305. Witness, LJ. Just those two initials at the end, that lethal, minimalist signature, told them this wasn't just a misstep. It was a full-blown disaster in the making. Somewhere inside that sterile maze of monitors, someone whispered, "She was there." The room fell into instinctive crisis posture. Voices dropped, laptops opened, jurisdictional authority shifted. Within seconds, the ACAR system aboard Flight 305 chimed directly into the cockpit. The message was short and stripped of euphemism. "Review attached. Captain discretion advised." Passenger listed, Frank Miller. Immediate protocol active. In Seat 0A, the jump seat, Captain Eva Rostova read the notice, then read it again, not because she didn't understand it, but because rage, when paired with protocol, demanded a second reading just to avoid legal overreaction. Rostova wasn't a stranger to military protocol. She had once landed a battered C-130 in Kandahar during a sandstorm while guiding in a medevac chopper on limited comms. She didn't rattle easily, but this felt personal. Not because she knew Frank Miller, but because she knew his pain. Not metaphorically, not through headlines, but in real flesh and bone memory. The war widow who wore her husband's dog tags under her scarf at the grocery store and got asked if they were just for fashion. The amputee who missed a flight once because TSA insisted on swabbing his prosthetic. She had seen the rot, and now one of her own crew, or worse, the company she flew for, was at the center of it. Ava closed the flight plan and stood up, startling her co-pilot. "You have the leg," she said flatly. He blinked. "Ma'am?" "You're flying this one," she repeated, already heading for the cockpit door. "Don't ask questions. Just stay sharp." Her voice carried that clipped military tone that didn't invite discussion. It demanded compliance. As she stepped out into the jet bridge, a few gate crew turned their heads. They thought maybe it was an engine inspection or a last-minute fuel calculation. They didn't expect her to stride past with her uniform immaculate, her stride surgical, her face an indictment wrapped in lipstick. This wasn't a check-in. This was an intervention. Captain Rostova's heels clicked against the polished floor of the terminal like a gavel slamming down. She scanned the crowd calmly, but with unmistakable intent, her eyes sweeping past the snack bar, the gate screen, and finally locking on Brenda. The gate agent didn't notice, yet, still preoccupied micromanaging the carry-on dimensions of a tired-looking dad. Eva didn't break stride. She didn't make a scene, but anyone watching closely would have noticed the tightening of her jaw, the micro-expression of disgust registering as she zeroed in. Let's be clear. This wasn't about saving face for Skylink. Eva wasn't here to polish corporate optics. She was here because something sacred had been violated on her flight under her command, and that, to her, wasn't a PR issue. It was a failure of moral order. Code Omega wasn't just an alert. It was a litmus test of institutional integrity, and someone had just failed it in broad daylight with a laminated name tag and a superiority complex. She passed through the boarding gate, head high, spine straight, each step screaming one message. A reckoning was en route, and she wasn't going to knock before entering. Zone 3 was boarding with the usual chaos. A swirl of roller bags, passive-aggressive stares at overhead bins, and the ritualistic power dance of who got to block the aisle first. In the middle of it all, Brenda was back in her element, reasserting dominion one seat number at a time. She called out boarding groups like a tyrant with a megaphone and a spreadsheet, blissfully unaware that the air had shifted. Not the temperature, no, but the atmosphere. It had thickened, changed, because from the mouth of the jet bridge emerged not a technician, not a tardy flight crew member, but Captain Eva Rostova. She didn't stride out. She arrived. Uniform crisp, cap straight, hair pinned back with the kind of precision that made her look less like a pilot and more like an indictment dressed in regulation navy blue. She wasn't rushing, but somehow every step carried a verdict. The silence didn't hit all at once, but rather like a slow voltage. First, the gate staff, then the passengers closest to her, until even the flight monitors seemed to pause in anticipation. Brenda noticed her by accident, halfway through admonishing a mother for attempting to carry both a diaper bag and a purse. "That's 2 personal items, ma'am," she was saying, when Eva's profile registered. At first, Brenda assumed it was a last-minute boarding adjustment, maybe a manifest check. But her internal certainty began to buckle when Eva didn't stop at the counter. She didn't glance at the boarding roster. She didn't acknowledge Brenda at all. Instead, she walked right past, laser-locked on one figure seated at the edge of the waiting area, Frank Miller. And that's when it clicked for Brenda, too late, of course, that the iceberg wasn't up ahead. It was already beneath her feet. Eva stopped in front of Frank with military precision. Her voice cut through the terminal with crisp clarity, loud enough for the entire boarding area to hear, but low enough to humiliate. "Sergeant Frank Miller?" Frank looked up slowly. The old-school way. The way men do when they've been taught never to expect dignity, but still recognize it when it arrives. "Yes, ma'am?" What happened next was not in the Skylink employee handbook. It was not on the training videos. It was not in Brenda's laminated script. Eva Rostova stood straight, drew herself to full height, then executed a sharp, textbook military salute. Shoulders squared, eyes locked, hand raised in flawless alignment. Not rushed, not performative. It was the kind of salute that makes men cry at funerals and makes silence sweep across a room like a cleansing wind. The boarding gate went still. Even the crying baby in 7D stopped mid-squawk. Frank, stunned, stood slowly, his posture instinctively shifting back into the form of a man who once wore the uniform without question. He returned the salute, not stiff, not formal, but with something even deeper. Reverence. For the moment. For what it meant. For someone finally remembering. Eva held the pose a second longer, then dropped her arm with precision and spoke. "Sergeant, I am Captain Eva Rostova, commanding officer of Flight 305. I've been informed of the treatment you received today, treatment that falls far beneath the standards of this airline, this profession, and frankly, this country." You could almost hear Brenda's skin retracting into itself. Eva continued, her tone colder now, calibrated for public address. "On behalf of Skylink Airlines, I offer you our apology, and more than that, our respect. What happened at this gate was not just inappropriate, it was unacceptable. You asked for nothing more than what was owed to you, what you earned with pain, blood, and quiet integrity, and you were met with suspicion, dismissal, and mockery. That ends now." Brenda shifted behind her podium, suddenly aware that the phrase "discretion of the gate agent" had a shelf life shorter than a warm yogurt left in Terminal C. The captain's eyes cut once toward Brenda, just long enough to register disgust, but not long enough to dignify her with dialogue. Then back to Frank. "You will not wait for Zone 4. You will not board among the crowd, and you will not walk this bridge alone. You served with honor. Today, honor walks you aboard. Her words didn't shout. They landed. They echoed in the bones of everyone watching. The boy with the skateboard, the couple holding hands, even the jaded businessman on his fourth connecting flight looked up like he'd just remembered what respect sounded like. And with that, Eva stepped slightly aside, extending her arm, not in deference, but in solidarity. Frank blinked, visibly shaken, but nodded. "I don't know what to say," he muttered. "You don't have to say a damn thing, Sergeant," Eva replied, a faint crack in her composure now. "You've already said it with your life." And as the two of them turned toward the jet bridge, side by side, one in uniform, one in pain, both walking taller than anyone else in Terminal C, nobody moved except Brenda. She moved just enough to realize she'd made herself the most expendable thing at Gate 7B. Captain Eva Rostova stood like a verdict in a flight cap, flanked by silence so sharp it might as well have been part of her uniform. Her salute had already sliced through the sterile hush of Gate 7B, but now came the second blade. Words. Not the polished, scripted kind a corporation pays PR interns to regurgitate. No, what she delivered next was raw steel, forged from the kind of clarity you don't learn in boardrooms but in barracks, on tarmacs soaked with jet fuel and memories that never quite fade. She turned slightly, addressing not just Frank but the entire gate area. Passengers, gate agents, snack cart attendants, and whatever middle manager had been pretending to check emails 3 seats away. "What happened here today," she said evenly, "was a failure. Not of policy, but of principle. And I want everyone in this terminal to understand something. This airline does not exist because of efficiency metrics or customer loyalty programs. It exists because men like Sergeant Frank Miller kept it safe to fly, kept this nation free to function, kept your vacation plans and business trips and spring breaks possible." Brenda, still glued to her keyboard like a faltering air traffic controller clinging to protocol, dared a scoff under her breath, something halfway between disbelief and wounded pride. Eva's head turned a fraction, enough to acknowledge the disturbance without ever lowering her tone. "And no," she said coolly, "this is not about performative guilt. I'm not here to save face for Skylink. I'm here to correct it." She pivoted back to Frank. "You weren't asking for a handout, Sergeant. You weren't angling for perks. You asked, quietly, respectfully, for something you earned with shrapnel and sacrifice. A little space, a little dignity, and you were denied not because the system failed. You were denied because someone wearing the airline's uniform mistook uniformity for judgment and arrogance for authority. That ends now." Frank shifted, discomfort etched into the lines around his eyes, not because he was embarrassed by her words, but because attention itself had never been his currency. He cleared his throat. "Captain, I don't want special treatment. I just needed a minute to get to my seat before—" Eva raised her hand, not to silence him, but to anchor the moment. "Sergeant Miller, with respect, I'm not offering you special treatment. I'm offering you a seat that was never mine to begin with. I may have been assigned 1A, but on this aircraft, on this day, that seat belongs to Honor. And Honor is wearing a Purple Heart and trying not to wince every time he shifts in his chair." You could feel the tension break, like a pressure valve easing open. The young couple with the stroller looked up. The tired businessman from earlier sat straighter. A gate attendant from across the terminal discreetly stopped typing. People weren't just watching now. They were listening. Frank tried again, this time more softly. "You don't have to do that." Eva nodded, resolute. "Actually, Sergeant, I do. Because I refuse to command a flight that takes off under a shadow. I won't fly this aircraft until this wrong has been made right, and that begins with this. You board first. You sit in 1A, and I'll take the jump seat." There was no applause, no viral video in the making, just a quiet recalibration of collective conscience, like a room full of people suddenly realizing they'd all been staring at the wrong person. It wasn't about prestige, it was about precedent. Eva stepped aside, offering her arm, not in pity, but in deference. Frank took it, not out of weakness, but to affirm something larger than either of them. The understanding that dignity, once violated, must be restored publicly, or not at all. And as they turned toward the jet bridge, a voice from the back, a low, older voice, murmured, "That's the kind of captain I'd follow anywhere." A few heads nodded. Some eyes lingered. But Brenda? Brenda stayed frozen, her terminal blinking innocently, as if it hadn't just betrayed everything her badge pretended to represent. Justice, it turned out, doesn't always wear a robe. Sometimes it wears pilot wings and walks with someone who still limps from a war nobody bothered to remember. And it was walking straight toward the cabin, seat 1A waiting, while shame stood grounded at the gate. What happened next would rewrite more than a seating chart. Eva didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Power, when rooted in moral clarity, rarely shouts. She simply turned, slowly and deliberately, toward the gate counter where Brenda stood pretending to be busy, eyes darting across her monitor like a stock trader trying to sell guilt before it tanked. The moment Brenda sensed that silence descending upon her desk, it was already too late. Eva's voice cut through the terminal, not loud, but razor-sharp. "Gate agent," she said, without naming her. "Not Brenda, not ma'am, not even you. Just gate agent," a phrase so stripped of dignity it might as well have been functionary. The way Eva said it, sterile, surgical, and public, was the professional equivalent of slapping someone across the face with their own policy manual. "You will see to it that Sergeant Miller's luggage is immediately transferred to the first-class cabin," Eva continued, her gaze not even softening, to acknowledge that Brenda had turned the color of a blank page. "You will also update his boarding pass to reflect seat 1A. Then, you will report to the station supervisor's office for debrief and further instruction. Immediately." Brenda froze. Her hands hovered above the keyboard, like they were no longer sure what fingers did. For a woman who once wielded the phrase, "my discretion," like a cudgel, she now looked like someone who had just realized she'd weaponized the wrong part of her job description, and had done so in front of a live audience with security cameras, smartphones, and a U.S. Attorney General in row 6. Her mouth opened, then closed. No apology came, just the helpless stammer of someone trying to remember the steps in a corporate survival handbook that doesn't actually include a chapter titled, "What to Do When You're Publicly Shamed by Your Pilot for Insulting a War Hero." The passengers didn't cheer. This wasn't a movie. But the silence changed texture. It wasn't passive anymore. It was full of judgment, of realization. A gate full of travelers had just been taught something that HR departments fail to teach, that there are consequences for casual cruelty when someone finally refuses to look away. And then, just behind the gathering storm, stood Letitia James, unassuming, silent, watching. She didn't step forward. She didn't clear her throat or drop her title like a gavel. She just stood, arms folded, expression unreadable, the kind of quiet that makes even powerful people nervous. Her presence said everything without saying a word. Justice doesn't need credit. It just needs momentum. As Ava passed Letitia, their eyes met for half a second. No words exchanged, no nod of alliance. Just a subtle, imperceptible shift, one that only two women who had spent their lives cleaning up the messes of lesser people would recognize. Letitia gave the smallest nod, like a chess master acknowledging a checkmate made with grace. Meanwhile, Brenda began tapping, her fingers jittering across the keyboard as if trying to conjure innocence through WPM. The screen blinked. A printer whirred. Frank's new boarding pass slid into the tray with the finality of a legal summons, and while Brenda, suddenly demoted from gatekeeper to cautionary tale, fumbled through the motions of compliance, the rest of the terminal had already moved on. Not out of forgetfulness, but clarity. They now knew what leadership looked like, and it sure as hell didn't wear a polyester vest with a pin that said, "Here to help." The uniform had been restored to its rightful dignity, not on Brenda's shoulders, but on Frank's walk, slow and steady, toward a gate that had finally remembered what gates were built for. Passage, not judgment. Ahead, the jet bridge waited. So did the next reckoning, because culture doesn't just correct itself. Sometimes it needs a captain with a spine, a general with a phone, and a woman with nothing to prove, but everything to protect. The cabin of Flight 305 had never been quieter as Sergeant Frank Miller crossed the threshold, this time not as an afterthought, not as some elderly passenger herded in the shuffle of Zone 4 boarding, but as a man finally afforded what he'd long since earned, the right to be seen. The flight attendant at the front didn't chirp a script about tray tables or seat belts. She stepped forward, placed a hand gently over her heart, and said with a reverence that could not be rehearsed, "Welcome aboard, Sergeant Miller. Your seat is ready." Seat 1A wasn't just polished leather and legroom that didn't require a yoga background to enter. Today it was a symbol, a reclamation, a stage even, though Frank had never been one for spotlights. As he moved toward it, slow and deliberate, passengers looked up and stayed up. Nobody fumbled with earbuds. Nobody ducked into a paperback to avoid eye contact. The gravity of the moment pulled them all into orbit. One man in row 3 stood and nodded. A woman in a business suit murmured, "Thank you," under her breath, like a benediction. Somewhere in the back, a teenager stopped chewing his gum mid-pop. Frank sat, not with entitlement, but with the careful precision of someone unused to being treated like a priority. His hand brushed the armrest like he half expected it to vanish, like this was all some elaborate error he'd be booted from at the last second. But it held, and so did he. Then, just before takeoff, Captain Eva Rostova re-emerged, not from obligation, not for optics, but because some things are worth delivering in person. She knelt beside Frank's seat, resting a steady hand on his shoulder, a gesture that somehow managed to feel both commanding and deeply human. "My father," she began, her voice lower now, less courtroom, more living room, "was a Marine. 30 years in, fought in Beirut, retired with 4 slipped discs, 3 medals, and 1 funeral no one ever reported on." She paused, eyes scanning the cabin briefly, then back to Frank. "He once told me the worst pain a soldier carries isn't in the body. It's watching the world move on like your sacrifice was a rounding error." Frank blinked hard. Words didn't come easily in that moment, and they didn't have to. Ava leaned in closer. "I didn't give you my seat because you're fragile. I gave it to you because this airline's first-class section had yet to meet someone who actually deserved it." A half laugh broke through Frank's chest, rusty, dry, but alive. You sound like my old CO. He used to say the only thing more dangerous than underestimating a Marine was overestimating your own moral high ground. Eva grinned. Smart man. Sounds like he'd have hated Brenda. Frank chuckled again, this time with less hesitation. He'd have called her a civilian casualty of character. The two shared a glance that cut through bureaucracy, generations, and the billion-dollar sheen of corporate pretense. This wasn't about brands or apologies anymore. It was about a basic, elemental form of justice: recognition. As Ava rose to return to the cockpit, the moment lingered in the air. It didn't need hashtags. It didn't need branding campaigns. What it needed was what it got. A room full of Americans, many of whom had been ignoring one another for the past 40 minutes, unified in quiet respect for the man in 1A. Some stood. Not dramatically, not in unison, just instinctively, like maybe, for the first time in a long time, they understood the difference between status and stature. And Frank? He didn't puff up or soak it in. He just nodded once, almost imperceptibly, then looked out the window, the horizon stretching ahead like a road he'd walked more times than anyone could guess. It wasn't about the seat. It never was. It was about being told, clearly, publicly, and without condition, that after all the years, all the pain, and all the silent compromises, someone still remembered what it meant to salute with sincerity, and someone still meant it. By the time Flight 305 touched down in San Diego, the shockwaves had already made landfall. Somewhere between cruising altitude and final descent, Skylink Airlines had discovered that the real turbulence wasn't in the air. It was in their inbox, and it didn't come with a seatbelt sign. It came with accountability, the kind that doesn't ask for your frequent flyer number, just your conscience. The announcement was swift, surgical, almost suspiciously well written, as if corporate legal had been waiting years for the perfect opportunity to dust off the "we deeply regret" template. Brenda, the once smug gate agent turned national punchline, had been formally suspended pending investigation, which in HR speak roughly translates to, "We finally noticed the barn's on fire and would like to remind you we always care deeply about the animals inside." The internal memo leaked within hours, of course. Effective immediately, Skylink will implement mandatory sensitivity training regarding veterans' rights, Purple Heart accommodations, and disability protocol across all personnel tiers. Beautiful, bureaucratic poetry. Nothing says we get it now quite like realizing your frontline employees think Purple Heart is a brand of chewing gum. As the story trickled into press channels, the airline's tone shifted from defensive to desperate. Suddenly, they weren't just correcting a mistake. They were launching an initiative. They unveiled a partnership with the Wounded Warrior Project, complete with a press release that somehow managed to use the phrase veteran-centered transformation without choking on its own irony. One paragraph, buried near the end, noted that the action was taken at the respectful request of a passenger involved in the incident who declined public recognition. That passenger, of course, was Frank Miller. Frank, for his part, had already left the terminal by then. No comment, no press stop, just a quiet walk toward the reunion he almost skipped. Because for him, this wasn't about headlines or hashtags. It was about something much simpler: dignity returned without spectacle. But then came the twist the media hadn't seen coming. Journalists combing through passenger lists, flight logs, and blurry cell phone footage began to piece together an unmistakable profile. Sitting quietly in the corner that morning, holding her phone, watching everything, making no scene, no selfie, no sound. Letitia James. Once the connection was made, the press reached out, hungrily. They wanted a quote, a reaction, maybe even a headline. Attorney General saves Marine at Gate 7B. But Letitia had no interest in hero narratives. She responded with one line. I did what any decent person should do. No more, no less. And that was that. No national address. No campaign backdrop. Just a quiet affirmation that power, when wielded correctly, doesn't require applause. It requires action. Meanwhile, the commentators circled. Some praised the airline's rapid response, while others, more astute, noted the obvious. It shouldn't have taken a Marine's humiliation, a captain's defiance, and a top federal official silently watching like a moral landmine for a corporation to remember the basics of human decency. But such is modern industry. Performatively progressive until someone gets publicly called out for institutional rot. As for Brenda, her face was now a case study in everything a name tag can't fix. Sympathy was scarce, as were job offers. One outlet noted she had previously demonstrated exemplary punctuality. A perfect closing joke, really. She showed up on time, just not for the right fight. Skylink's board scrambled to scrub down its reputation, but reputations don't clean easily when the stain comes from arrogance in polyester. Their branding pivoted overnight, flags on their Twitter banner, veteran-first banners in terminals, and a sudden surge in patriotic ad buys. The same airline that allowed a war hero to be mocked now wanted you to know they salute you at every gate. Cute, but the truth lingered beneath it all, stubborn and inconvenient. Culture doesn't change through crisis PR. It changes when one person stands up, another refuses to stay down, and the rest finally realize the cost of silence. And at Gate 7B that day, silence had a price. Frank paid for it in pain. Letitia covered the tax with vigilance. Eva closed the deal with authority, and the rest, they just watched, until it was too late to pretend they hadn't. At the reunion, nobody asked Frank to tell the story. That's how you know it mattered. Real stories never need an invitation. They arrive, quiet and unassuming, and sit down at the table like they've always belonged. His old unit, what was left of them, gathered around worn picnic tables at the VFW hall, their posture stiffer than their joints, eyes more alert than their age suggested. They talked about grandkids, new meds, bad knees. But then someone said, "Heard something happened at the airport," and that was all it took. Frank didn't embellish. He didn't dramatize. He recounted the moment with the same tone he might have used to describe sandbagging a trench. Matter of fact, careful, almost apologetic. Gate agent gave me some grief. Wasn't the first time. But someone noticed this time. A pilot stepped in. Moved me up front. That's all. Except it wasn't all. They knew it. He knew it. Because every man around that table had been walked past, looked through, treated like a relic until Veterans Day rolled around and someone needed a photo op for a city council campaign. But not this time. This time, someone in a captain's uniform had drawn a line, and someone in a government position had reinforced it without needing to raise her voice or her profile. The room got quiet. Not the kind of awkward quiet, but the kind that happens when men who've lived through things realize something they thought was gone still existed. Dignity. In public. Without a hashtag. One of them muttered, "Damn right they moved you to first class." And a couple of others chuckled. Not because it was funny, but because it was rare. Like watching decency reappear after years on the endangered species list. Word spread. Not because Frank shared it, but because someone else did. A passenger, then a pilot, then a tweet, then a veterans forum. The story threaded its way through the community like an old war tune. Familiar, stirring, a reminder of who they were and what they still expected from the country they once carried on their backs. For weeks, it bounced through newsletters, VA offices, breakfast meetups, and retirement homes. Not because of the drama, but because of the principle. A wounded veteran had been insulted, and someone had chosen not to look away, not to play it safe, not to wait for someone else. It wasn't the kind of story that became a made-for-TV movie. It didn't have explosions or courtroom showdowns. But it had weight, and it had names people remembered, not because they were famous, but because they were decent. Captain Eva Rostova, who didn't ask permission before doing the right thing. Letitia James, who didn't need a camera to prove she saw everything. And Frank Miller, who didn't demand justice, but received it anyway. That combination, authority, witness, humility, became the holy trinity of a story that made its way into locker room talk, church sermons, and veteran podcasts. Some called it the redemption of Gate 7B. Others just called it finally. But everyone agreed on one thing. It shouldn't take a national scandal to get a war hero treated like a human being. In a culture where silence has become currency and confrontation is labeled rude, the most revolutionary act sometimes is the simplest one. Standing up when others sit down and speaking plainly when others choke on HR scripts. Frank said it best, in the only sentence from that night that made it into a local paper. It's easy to let things slide. It's harder to stand up. But someone stood up that day, and it changed everything. And somewhere in an airport lounge, a new employee is being trained. This time, not with a laminated checklist, but with a story. A true one. Because culture doesn't shift with memos. It shifts with memory. And Gate 7B will not be forgotten.